The Xarn fleet moved through the cold void of space like a tidal wave of destruction, their warships vast and bristling with weapons. They had conquered dozens of worlds, crushed countless civilizations beneath their might, and never once had they encountered an enemy that could truly challenge them. The human colony below was nothing more than another insignificant prize, a minor target in their endless campaign of expansion. Their warriors had already begun landing on the surface, overwhelming human defenses with ease. The screams of the dying echoed through their communication channels, a familiar sound that no longer stirred emotion within them. Victory was certain. The humans, despite their resistance, would fall like all the others. Yet, as the Xarn commander observed the battlefield from the bridge of his flagship, something unusual happened. A signal appeared on their sensors, a single lone warship approaching from deep space. It was small, insignificant compared to the massive Xarn fleet, but there was something strange about it. The way it moved, the way it seemed to glide through the void with a cold, precise efficiency. It did not behave like the warships of other species they had encountered. The commander frowned, his ridged brow furrowing in irritation. Why would a single human warship come here alone? It made no sense. Even if the humans had sent reinforcements, surely they would have sent an entire fleet, not just one ship. Was it a scout? A desperate last attempt to delay the inevitable? Whatever it was, it did not matter. The Xarn were unstoppable. He turned to his officers and gave the order to destroy the human vessel before it could interfere with their conquest. Across the Xarn fleet, weapons systems locked onto the approaching ship. The commander watched with mild amusement as bright lances of energy and torpedoes streaked across the darkness of space, all converging on the lone human warship. It should have been over in an instant. And yet, the impossible happened. The moment the weapons reached the human ship, they simply vanished. The energy blasts dissipated before they could make contact, absorbed by some kind of unseen force. The torpedoes, designed to obliterate even the most heavily armored warships, detonated harmlessly in the void as if repelled by an invisible barrier. The commander's amusement turned to confusion, then to something else, something he had never felt before. Unease. The human ship continued its approach, completely untouched, completely unaffected. It did not fire back immediately. It did not rush into combat. It simply advanced with an eerie calmness, as if analyzing, observing, waiting. The Xarn warriors on the bridge exchanged nervous glances. The commander clenched his fists. This was not normal. No enemy had ever been able to resist their opening barrage so easily. He barked new orders, demanding a full-scale attack. The Xarn fleet unleashed everything they had. Hundreds of warships fired at once, the combined might of an armada pouring its fury upon a single target. The space around the human ship burned with explosions, energy beams slicing through the void in a dazzling display of destruction. And yet, when the light faded, the ship was still there, untouched, unharmed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, for the first time, the human ship responded. It did not fire wildly, did not unleash a chaotic barrage like the Xarn. Instead, it fired with precision. A single shot from its main weapon streaked through the darkness, cutting through the lead Xarn cruiser as if it were made of paper. There was no explosion, no dramatic destruction. The cruiser simply ceased to exist, torn apart on a molecular level, its debris scattering into the void. The Xarn commander felt a cold dread settle into his bones. This was not just an enemy warship. This was something else entirely. The Xarn fleet scrambled, adjusting tactics, trying to regroup. But it was too late. The human ship moved like a predator among prey, weaving through their ranks with impossible speed, targeting their weaknesses with terrifying accuracy. Every shot it fired claimed a Xarn warship. Every maneuver it made left their formations in chaos. The Xarn, who had always been the hunters, were now the hunted. Panic spread through the fleet. Warriors who had never known fear now felt it creeping into their very souls. The commander shouted orders, trying to restore control, but deep down, he knew the truth. The Dominion had never faced an enemy like this before, and for the first time, they were no longer certain of victory. The Xarn fleet moved through space like an unstoppable force, their warships dark and monstrous against the backdrop of the void. They had never known fear, never known defeat, and had never considered the possibility that any species could challenge them. The human colony below was already in flames, its defenses crumbling under the relentless assault of the Xarn warriors. Victory was inevitable, just as it had been for every world they had conquered before. The Xarn commander stood on the bridge of his flagship, his cold eyes fixed on the unfolding destruction. But then, something unexpected happened. A single signal appeared on the sensors. An approaching vessel. It was human, but small, alone, an insignificant blip compared to the overwhelming force of the Dominion's fleet. The commander frowned, wondering if this was a desperate last attempt at resistance. Perhaps the humans had sent a scout, a warning ship that would flee to call for reinforcements. It did not matter. One ship meant nothing against the might of the Dominion. He ordered his fleet to destroy it before it could come any closer. Across the Xarn fleet, targeting systems locked on, and within moments, hundreds of energy blasts and missiles surged toward the incoming human vessel, a storm of destruction meant to erase it from existence before it could even engage. But then, something happened that should have been impossible. The weapons hit, but did nothing. The energy beams vanished as if absorbed by an invisible force. The torpedoes detonated uselessly in the void, repelled before reaching their target. The human ship continued forward, completely unharmed, moving with an eerie calmness that sent a ripple of unease through the Xarn ranks. The commander's grip tightened on the armrest of his command chair. No enemy had ever withstood such an attack before. He barked new orders, demanding a second strike, this time with everything they had. The Xarn fleet obeyed, unleashing a full-scale bombardment, their most powerful weapons lighting up the darkness of space. The sheer force of the assault should have reduced the human ship to dust, but when the fire cleared, the vessel remained, untouched, still advancing. For the first time in his life, the commander felt something foreign creep into his mind. Doubt. Then, the human ship retaliated. It did not fire in wild desperation. It did not unleash a chaotic barrage of weapons. Instead, it struck with surgical precision. A single energy beam lanced through the lead Xarn battleship, cutting it apart in an instant, its hull splitting into two before vanishing in a silent explosion. No warning, no struggle, just destruction. The Xarn fleet hesitated, their formations breaking apart as uncertainty spread like poison. The human warship did not hesitate. It moved through their ranks like a phantom. Every shot it fired destroying another Dominion vessel. It was not a battle, it was an execution. The Xarn had never faced an enemy like this, had never known the terror of being outmatched, and now, their greatest fleet was being torn apart by a single ship. The commander shouted desperate orders, trying to rally his forces, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before him. But deep in his gut, he knew the truth. The humans were not weak. They were not prey. They were something else entirely. And as the remains of his once mighty fleet burned around him, he realized, with horrifying certainty, that the Dominion had made the greatest mistake in its history. Panic spread like wildfire through the Xarn fleet as the human warship continued its ruthless assault, carving through their ranks with terrifying precision. What had begun as a simple conquest had turned into a nightmare beyond imagination. The Xarn had never faced an enemy like this before. An enemy that did not just fight, but dominated, an enemy that did not flinch, did not hesitate, did not show mercy. The Dominion had always believed themselves to be the supreme force of the galaxy, the conquerors of countless worlds, the unstoppable tide that swept across the stars. Yet now, in the span of mere minutes, that illusion was being shattered. The human warship moved like a phantom, weaving through their formations with an unnatural grace. dodging every desperate counterattack, striking with brutal efficiency. Every time it fired, a Xarn warship ceased to exist, torn apart with such precision that it almost seemed surgical. The commander, his mind racing, barked frantic orders to regroup, to surround the human vessel, to overwhelm it with sheer numbers. But nothing worked. Every strategy that had once led them to victory, every battle tactic perfected over centuries of conquest, was utterly useless against this one ship. It did not fight like any enemy they had faced before. It was as if it could predict their movements, as if it knew their weaknesses before they even revealed them. The Dominion warriors, once fearless and unshakable, now hesitated, their confidence crumbling with every ship that fell. Some tried to flee, breaking formation, attempting to escape the slaughter, but the human warship was merciless. It hunted them down, striking with the cold, methodical precision of an executioner. There was no escape. The Xarn, who had always been the predators, were now the prey. The commander's heart pounded in his chest as he watched his fleet, his once mighty armada, reduced to burning wreckage. He had never known fear before, had never understood what it meant to be powerless. But now, as he stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring at the destruction unfolding before him, he felt something new, something alien, a terrible, inescapable realization that the Dominion was not the most powerful force in the galaxy. The humans had changed everything. And if the Xarn did not adapt, if they did not find a way to stop this nightmare, their empire, everything they had built, everything they had fought for, would soon be nothing more than a memory, a forgotten remnant of a species that once thought itself invincible. The Xarn flagship trembled as another one of its escort ships exploded nearby, torn apart by the relentless assault of the human warship. The bridge was filled with alarms, flashing red lights, and the frantic shouts of officers trying to make sense of the impossible. The Dominion had ruled the stars for centuries, their fleets unstoppable, their warriors unmatched. And yet, in mere moments, they had been reduced to nothing more than terrified prey. The commander clenched his fists, his mind racing for a way out, for a strategy, for something, anything, that could turn the tide. But there was no turning the tide. This was not a battle. This was an execution. The human warship did not fight with the brute force that Xarn were used to. It did not charge forward in reckless bravery. It moved like a shadow, precise, controlled, like a predator playing with its food before delivering the final blow. Every Xarn warship that tried to counterattack was erased in an instant, their hulls sliced apart, their crews never even realizing they had been targeted before it was too late. The commander gritted his teeth as he watched the devastation unfold on the holographic battle map before him. The Xarn fleet was in chaos. Some captains, too terrified to think rationally, had abandoned their formations, attempting to flee in any direction possible. But the human warship did not let them escape. It hunted them down one by one, eliminating every last vessel, as if it were cleaning the battlefield of pests. The Dominion had never suffered a defeat like this before. Even in past battles where they had faced heavy resistance, they had at least been able to retreat, to regroup, to learn from their mistakes. But this was something else entirely. This was annihilation. The commander turned to his officers, his voice sharp and commanding, demanding reports, demanding answers. But none of them had any. Their weapons were useless. Their shields might as well have been paper. Their tactics, once flawless against every other species they had crushed beneath their rule, meant nothing against this single human warship. It was as if the humans had been preparing for this fight for centuries, as if they had studied every possible weakness of the Xarn before even engaging. But how? How could this be possible? The Dominion was supposed to be the apex force of the galaxy. They had ruled unchallenged for so long that the very thought of an enemy capable of standing against them had seemed absurd. And yet here it was, proof that they were not invincible, proof that the humans were something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The commander felt a slow, creeping dread settle in his gut. This warship, it was not just a powerful weapon. It was a message, a warning. Humanity was not weak. Humanity was not to be underestimated. And now, as the last of his fleet was reduced to drifting wreckage, he understood the truth. The Xarn Dominion had just met its greatest enemy, and they were not ready for what was coming next. The Xarn commander stood frozen, his claws gripping the edge of his control panel, as the cold realization settled deep into his bones. This was not just a battle. This was the end of an era. The human warship moved with the precision of a predator, eliminating his fleet piece by piece, never wasting a shot, never hesitating. The Xarn had always believed themselves to be the dominant force in the galaxy, their fleets the unbreakable hammer of conquest, their warriors the executioners of lesser species. And yet, here they were, helpless against a single enemy ship. The bridge was a cacophony of alarms, desperate voices of officers scrambling for solutions, reports of ship after ship being destroyed before they could even react. The Dominion fleet had never suffered a defeat like this, never even conceived of the possibility that an enemy could dismantle them so effortlessly. The commander barked new orders, his voice sharp, demanding that the remaining warships focus all firepower on the human vessel. If one strike could not break through its defenses, then maybe an overwhelming assault, every cannon, every missile, every weapon they had, would be enough. His remaining ships obeyed, regrouping, adjusting their formations, and unleashing everything in their arsenal. A storm of destruction roared through space, the combined might of the Dominion's most powerful warships surging toward their enemy. And yet, when the fire cleared, the human warships still remained, unscathed, untouched, unstoppable. The commander's breath caught in his throat. No enemy had ever withstood the full power of the Dominion before. No enemy had ever survived such an onslaught. But this ship, it didn't just survive. It thrived in the chaos. And then, it retaliated. The human warship fired with cold precision, cutting through the Xarn fleet like a scalpel through flesh. Entire cruisers were erased in an instant, their hulls shredded by energy beams that bypassed shields as if they didn't even exist. The flagship trembled as another explosion rocked its side, sending officers sprawling to the floor. The commander's mind raced. Was this truly human technology? No species had ever developed weaponry of this caliber, defenses that rendered even the Dominion's might useless. Had they underestimated humanity so completely? Had they, in their arrogance, ignored a threat that had been growing in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? The realization made his blood run cold. The Xarn had thought of humans as nothing more than another minor species, another world to be conquered, another civilization to be erased. But they had been wrong. So very, very wrong. The humans had been watching, preparing. And now, with a single warship, they had shattered the illusion of the Dominion's invincibility. The commander felt the weight of it settle upon him, a suffocating truth that he could no longer ignore. This was not just a battle. This was a warning, a message. Humanity had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Xarn flagship drifted through the battlefield, surrounded by the wreckage of what was once the mightiest fleet in the galaxy. Fires raged across the torn remains of warships, their twisted metal husks floating lifelessly in the void. What had been an armada of unstoppable power was now nothing more than scattered debris, a graveyard of Dominion arrogance. The commander's mind struggled to comprehend what had happened, but no amount of denial could change the truth. His fleet had been annihilated, and he had never even seen it coming. The human warship had not just defeated them. It had shattered the very foundation of everything the Dominion believed in. The Xarn had ruled through fear, through overwhelming strength, through the certainty that no species could ever rise against them. And yet, in mere moments, all of that had been proven false. The ship, the single, terrifyingly efficient human ship, remained untouched, undamaged, like a reaper calmly moving through a field of fallen prey. The Xarn had been the hunters once. Now, they were the hunted. The few surviving Dominion warships, scattered and broken, had stopped fighting. Some had attempted to flee, their engines burning bright as they tried to escape the nightmare. But it did not matter. The human warship had allowed none to survive. It pursued them relentlessly, striking them down one by one, never showing mercy, never missing a target. Every Xarn warrior who had ever laughed at the weakness of other species now understood what true weakness felt like. The commander gritted his teeth, his sharp claws trembling against the controls of his ship. He had led invasions across the stars, watched civilizations fall before his might, crushed entire worlds beneath his forces. But this was something he had never experienced. Not just loss, obliteration. The realization made his insides twist with something he had never known before. Dread. A deep primal terror that he had only ever seen in the eyes of those he conquered. He had always taken pleasure in that fear, in the knowledge that the Dominion was the supreme power in the galaxy, unchallenged and unstoppable. But now, that fear belonged to him. The human warship had sent no demands, no transmissions, no warnings. It had simply arrived and reduced the most powerful fleet in the galaxy to ashes. And that silence was more terrifying than any declaration of war. It meant that humanity did not see the Dominion as an opponent worth negotiating with. They had come to destroy. The commander's chest tightened as the human ship finally turned toward him. The last of his fleet was gone. He was alone, his flagship barely functional, its defenses crippled, its weapons useless. There was nothing left. And yet, the ship did not fire. Not yet. It loomed before him, its cold, dark silhouette a symbol of something far greater than mere war. It was the shadow of a new force rising in the galaxy. The Dominion had ruled unchallenged for centuries, but that reign was over now. Humanity had arrived, and they had made their message clear. The commander's breath was shallow. His eyes locked onto the warship that had destroyed everything he had ever known. For the first time in Xarn history, the conquerors had become the conquered. And as the final shot was fired, as the flagship was consumed in white-hot energy, the last thought that crossed his mind was not of anger or vengeance. It was of horror, because he knew, beyond any doubt, that this was only the beginning. The void of space was eerily silent now, the battlefield reduced to nothing more than drifting wreckage and the fading embers of dying warships. The once mighty Dominion fleet, the terror of 100 star systems, had been erased as if it had never existed. And at the center of it all, untouched, unchallenged, and utterly dominant, was the human warship. It floated among the ruins with a quiet menace, its dark hull gleaming under the distant light of a dying star. No distress calls had been sent. No survivors remained to tell the tale. The Xarn had believed themselves to be the apex predators of the galaxy, the supreme rulers of all they saw, but they had been proven wrong in the most brutal way possible. They had not been beaten in a long, hard-fought war. They had not been gradually pushed back, forced to surrender over time. No, they had been wiped out in a single encounter, their entire fleet reduced to burning debris in mere minutes. And that was the most terrifying part of all. The humans had not struggled. They had not fought as if this were a battle that could be won or lost. They had fought as if the outcome had been decided before it even began, as if the Xarn had never stood a chance. In the depths of space, across the Dominion's vast empire, the news would soon spread, although there would be no official reports, no transmissions from survivors, because there were none. The only record of what had happened here would be the absence of the fleet that had once stood as the pride of the Dominion. The ruling councils, the generals, the warlords who had built their empire on the foundation of fear, would be left with only questions, only a terrible uncertainty that would eat away at them. Who were the humans? How had they done this? And the most terrifying question of all, was this just the beginning? The warlords would argue. They would seek answers. They would scramble to make sense of the impossible. But deep down, a seed of fear had already been planted. They had believed the galaxy belonged to them. that no force could ever stand against them. But now, they knew the truth. The humans had been watching, waiting. And when they finally made their move, they had done so with the cold efficiency of a species that did not seek war for conquest, but for survival. True, merciless survival. The Dominion had ruled through terror, but now, they had become the ones who feared the darkness. And the worst part, the humans had not even sent their full force. This was just one warship. Just one. And it had destroyed them without effort. What would happen when the rest of the human fleet arrived? The Dominion had spent centuries expanding, conquering, breaking worlds beneath their rule. But now, they faced something beyond their comprehension. Something they could not intimidate. Something that had no fear of them. And for the first time in their history, the Kaxarn would have to ask themselves a question they had never even considered before. How does it feel to be prey? Across the vast expanse of the Dominion's empire, an unnatural silence settled. A silence of uncertainty, of fear, of something the Kaxarn had never known before. The greatest fleet they had ever assembled had vanished without a trace, wiped from existence as if it had never been. No distress signals, no final transmissions, nothing but the cold, empty void where their warships had once stood, mighty and unchallenged. And though no official reports reached the war councils, the whispers began to spread. Entire battle groups had ceased responding. The fleet that was meant to crush humanity had simply disappeared. At first, the Dominion warlords refused to believe it. They scoffed at the rumors, dismissing them as impossible. The Kaxarn did not lose. They had ruled the galaxy for centuries, their power absolute, their fleets unmatched. How could a single battle, a single human warship, erase an armada that had conquered entire star systems? It had to be a mistake, a malfunction in communications, a trick played by the humans to sow confusion. But deep down, they knew. The fear began to creep into their thoughts, into their very bones, because if the rumors were true, if their fleet had truly been destroyed, then they were not the apex predators of the galaxy. They were not the strongest, nor the most advanced, nor the most feared. They were nothing but arrogant rulers who had finally met something greater, something beyond their control. And the most terrifying part of all, the humans had not spoken. They had not declared war. They had not sent warnings or demands. They had simply arrived, destroyed their enemy, and vanished without a trace. There were no ultimatums, no negotiations, no attempts at diplomacy. The Dominion had always assumed that their greatest war would come against an enemy like themselves, an empire seeking to replace them, a species desperate to rule as they had ruled. But this was different. The humans had not fought for conquest. They had fought as if this was merely another step in an inevitable future, as if they had already prepared for this moment long before the Dominion had even realized it was coming. And now, with no fleet left to defend them, the Kaxarn were left with a horrible, unshakable question. Was this just the beginning? Had the humans sent only a single warship to make a statement? Was the true force of their armada already on its way? The warlords, the conquerors who had spent their lives bringing entire civilizations to their knees, now faced the terrifying reality that they were no longer in control. For the first time in their history, the Kaxarn were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. And somewhere, out in the dark reaches of space, humanity watched and waited, deciding what would come next. Panic spread through the Dominion like a sickness, creeping into the minds of even the most hardened warlords. The Kaxarn had never faced a moment like this, had never known the weight of uncertainty, the suffocating grip of fear. They had built their empire on strength, on conquest, on the belief that no species could ever challenge them. And yet, in a single engagement, that belief had been shattered. Entire fleets had vanished without a trace. Generals and commanders, once proud and unshaken, now whispered in hushed tones, their voices laced with unease. No one knew how to react, because there had never been a scenario where the Dominion was not the victor. But now the impossible had happened. And worse, the humans still had not spoken. There were no demands, no threats, no negotiations, just silence. And in that silence, the Exarn felt something alien, something they had never experienced in their long reign of terror. Powerlessness. Across the Dominion, emergency meetings were held in darkened chambers, the warlords gathering in secret as they struggled to understand what had happened. Some demanded retaliation, screaming for fleets to be mobilized, for entire armies to be thrown at this human threat. But others, those who truly understood the weight of what had occurred, remained quiet. Retaliation. Against what? They had no idea how many human warships existed. If a single vessel had dismantled their most powerful fleet, what would happen if more arrived? What if this wasn't a war humanity had just started, but one they had already won? The thought sent a chill through the Tarn leadership. The Dominion had never known fear, but now it consumed them. And still, the humans waited. No attack came. No fleet moved to invade Tarn worlds. No messages were sent. The silence was the loudest warning they had ever received. It was as if the humans were giving them time to reflect, to understand, to truly grasp the new reality of the galaxy. The Tarn were no longer the rulers of all they saw. They were no longer the ones who decided the fate of other civilizations. A new power had emerged from the shadows, one that did not boast, did not threaten, did not need to prove its dominance with words. The proof had already been written in the wreckage of their lost fleet. And now, as the warlords sat in uneasy silence, their empire trembling beneath the weight of its first true defeat, they could not help but wonder, was this mercy? Or were the humans simply waiting for the right moment to strike again? The weight of uncertainty crushed the Dominion leadership, a slow suffocation of everything they had ever believed in. The warlords, the supreme rulers of the galaxy, sat in silence, their minds consumed by the same unspoken question. What now? The humans had done something no species had ever dared, had erased the most powerful fleet in the known universe as if it were nothing. And yet, they had not followed with an invasion, had not struck at the heart of Tarn territory, had not made any demands. They had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but ruins and fear. That fear spread like wildfire, igniting paranoia across the Dominion. Entire sectors, once fortified with confidence, now trembled at the thought of the unknown. Military officers who had spent their lives crushing resistance now hesitated before speaking, uncertain if their next order would be their last. The Xarn, who had built their empire on the foundation of absolute control, now felt control slipping through their claws like sand. But the worst part, the thing that kept them awake in the cold, sleepless nights, was that they did not know if the humans would return. Would they strike again, erasing another fleet as effortlessly as before? Would they come in numbers, bringing with them an armada that the Dominion could never hope to stop? Or was this silence the only warning they would receive, a quiet, patient message that their time as rulers was over? The warlords argued endlessly, their voices raw with desperation. Some called for immediate surrender, believing that to resist would be to invite extinction. Others, fueled by arrogance and blind rage, demanded a counterattack, swearing that the Dominion would not fall so easily. But deep down, they all knew the truth. They had no chance. They could send every ship they had, every warrior, every weapon, but it would not matter. The humans had already shown them what war against them looked like. And it was not a war. It was annihilation. The Dominion had ruled for centuries, had conquered without mercy, had enslaved worlds and broken civilizations without hesitation. They had believed themselves to be untouchable. But now, they finally understood what it meant to be powerless. And as they sat in the growing darkness of their crumbling empire, one thought echoed in every mind, in every chamber, in every fearful breath they took. The humans had given them a choice: accept their place in the new order of the galaxy, or wait for the inevitable. Because the humans were out there, watching, deciding, and when they returned, there would be no more warnings. Only the end. The Dominion was crumbling, Not from war, not from invasion, but from something far worse. Fear, the kind of fear that seeped into the very foundation of an empire, turning strength into hesitation, arrogance into silence, dominance into doubt. That Karn had ruled for centuries without question, without challenge, believing themselves to be the pinnacle of power. But now, that power felt fragile, like a dying flame flickering against the cold darkness of the unknown. The humans had struck once, and only once, yet the wound they left behind was deeper than any battle that Karn had ever fought. It was not just a defeat, it was a reckoning. The warlords, once proud and unshakable, now lived in the shadow of uncertainty. Every whisper in the halls of power, every flicker of static in their communications, every distant movement in the void filled them with dread. Was it them? Had the humans returned? Would this be the moment when their empire was erased in fire and silence, just like their fleet? They had tried to rebuild, to replace the forces they had lost, but the effort felt meaningless. What use were warships when the enemy had already proven that no fleet could stand against them? What use were armies when the enemy could wipe them out before they even had the chance to fight? For the first time in Dominion history, the Karn were not preparing for war. They were waiting for judgment, and the silence was suffocating. Across the empire, planets that had once cowered beneath the Dominion's rule began to stir. The Karn's grip had loosened, their control slipping, their iron rule now rusting under the weight of their own fear. The species they had conquered were watching, waiting, sensing the weakness that had never been there before. Rebellion simmered beneath the surface, whispers of defiance growing louder, bolder. The Karn had never known mercy, had never offered it, had never believed in anything but raw, brutal power. But now, they found themselves praying for mercy from a force that had no need to show it. The humans had not come to negotiate. They had not come to rule. They had simply demonstrated their power, and then they had left. And in that silence, in that unspoken warning, the Dominion found itself facing a truth they could no longer ignore. Their time was over. They could cling to their empire, fight against the inevitable, struggle against the tide of history. But deep down, they all knew the same thing. When the humans returned, they would not return as conquerors. They would return as executioners.